They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes the victims leave a diary. When I married Michael Beaumont, I thought I was starting a new life. I didn't realize I was stepping into the scene of a century-old crime, and that the only true inheritance I possessed was this vow of vengeance. My name is Jessica Moreau, and I have come to settle my family's account. Before the island, my world was a different kind of quiet. A quiet made of dust and brittle paper, of silent libraries and the hushed whispers of the long dead. I was an academic, a historian. My life was contained. It had modest means, but it was rich in the only currency I truly valued: knowledge, context, the intricate architecture of the past. I found a deep and abiding solace in deciphering 19th century letters, in tracing the ghosts of forgotten lives through shipping manifests and census records. It was an ordered world, a world I understood, a world where I felt safe. Then I met Michael. Meeting Michael felt like a collision of worlds. He was charming, yes, but it was more than that. It was a kindness, an easy grace that spoke of a life untouched by the kind of anxieties that had always shadowed the edges of my own. He moved through the world with a certainty that I found both foreign and captivating. He came from old money, a concept I'd only ever studied in books, but he never wore it like armor. He wore it like a comfortable coat, barely aware of its weight. I fell in love not with the Beaumont fortune, but with the man himself. With his genuine, unwavering interest in my work. He didn't just tolerate my passion for history. He was fascinated by it. He'd listen for hours as I spoke about trade routes and land disputes, his eyes never glazing over. He valued my mind. After a lifetime of feeling like my passions were esoteric, even strange, that was a powerful intoxicant. Marrying him was an act of love. It felt simple, pure, and his family's private island estate. It was a place of such breathtaking beauty. It felt like a fairy tale, a setting for a life I had never, in my wildest dreams, imagined for myself. A life of security, of beauty, of peace. A life where the past was just a pleasant story to be told, not a debt to be paid. The beginning of the end started in the most mundane of places, the attic. It was a Saturday in early spring. The air was thick with the scent of salt and jasmine. Michael wanted to clear out an old, unused office on the third floor. A space his great-grandfather Theron had apparently used. We were a team. Laughing, teasing each other, feeling for all the world like any other young couple building a life together. He was wrestling with a heavy oak desk, and I was tasked with sorting through a stack of old sea chests in the corner. Most were filled with moth-eaten nautical charts, brittle tide tables, the mundane detritus of a family that had made its fortune by the sea. But one chest was different. It was smaller, bound in dark, cracked leather and sealed with a rusted iron lock. It's strange, the small moments upon which a life pivots. The tiny, seemingly insignificant choices that, in retrospect, feel like the hand of fate. I could have just set that chest aside. I could have decided it was too much trouble. But I'm a historian. A locked box is not an obstacle. It's a question. I found an old letter opener and worked at the lock. It was stubborn, but after a few minutes of patient work, it gave way with a tired groan. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed charts, was a single object wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. I unwrapped it carefully. It was a leather-bound diary. Small, its cover worn smooth with time. There was no name on the outside, no indication of who it belonged to. I opened it. The paper was fragile, the ink faded from black to a soft sepia brown. The handwriting was elegant, a looping cursive that spoke of a disciplined hand. And on the first page, an entry. And a name. Adeline Moreau. Moreau. My name. Here. In this house. It sent a jolt through me, a strange electric shock that started in my fingertips and shot straight to my heart. It had to be a coincidence. It was a common enough name, especially with the French Creole history of the region. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but the date. October 12th, 1888. The dates aligned almost perfectly with the Beaumont family's official history, the year Theron Beaumont had acquired the island. My mind, the analytical engine I had spent my entire life honing, started to spin, connecting points I never knew existed. What was my family's story doing here? In the heart of the Beaumont legacy? I felt a sudden chill in the warm, dusty air. I closed the diary, my hands trembling slightly, and slipped it into the pocket of my jacket. Michael didn't notice. He had finally managed to wedge the desk through the doorway. He turned to me beaming, his face smudged with dirt. "Success," he said. "Now what treasures did you find?" I forced a smile. "Just some old maps," I said. "Nothing important." That night, I waited until the house was still. I waited until I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of Michael's breathing beside me in the dark. Then I slipped out of bed, took the diary from my jacket, and went into the adjoining study, closing the door as silently as I could. I opened it again. My heart was pounding. It felt like a transgression. A betrayal, but of whom I wasn't yet sure. I began to read. Adeline's voice was clear, hopeful. She wrote of their arrival on the island, not as pioneers discovering a wild land, but as owners. As she described the backbreaking work, the immense hardship, but also the profound joy of building something of their own. She wrote of the rich soil, of the thriving, self-sufficient community they had cultivated. She wrote of her husband, my great-great-grandfather, and the pride in his eyes as he looked over their fields. It was a story of hope, a story of a future being built, piece by painful piece. And then, a new name appeared in the entries. Theron Beaumont. Adeline described his arrival. A neighboring businessman. White, wealthy, and full of smiles and promises. He approached them under the guise of partnership, offering to help them expand, to navigate the complex legal systems from which they were so often excluded. He presented himself as an ally. A friend. I read the passage over and over. A description of their first meeting. "He has a kind face," she had written. "But he smiles with his mouth and not his eyes." She saw it. Even then. Even through all the hope and the desperation, she saw it. That little hint of unease. A single discordant note in the symphony of his charm. This was the man they celebrated. The visionary patriarch whose portrait hung in the grand hall downstairs. The man whose legacy had given my husband, the man I loved, everything he had. And my ancestor, with a wisdom born of bitter experience, had seen the predator behind the smile. A cold, heavy certainty began to settle in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a desecration. The next few days were a blur of clandestine activity. By day, I was Jessica Beaumont. Loving wife, a new and welcome addition to the family. I played the part. I smiled at dinners, complimented Michael's grandmother, Eleanor, on her gardens, and walked the pristine beaches, the sand feeling like grit beneath my feet. But by night, I was Jessica Moreau, historian, investigator. I used my academic credentials, my access to university databases and state archives to dig. The Beaumonts had spent a century curating their history, polishing it into a flawless, benevolent myth. They believed their version of the story because they had destroyed all the others. But they had made one mistake. They believed that some records, lost to courthouse fires and the deliberate neglect of a prejudiced bureaucracy, were gone forever. They didn't count on the digital age. They didn't count on a historian sleeping in their own house. And then I found it. A digital copy of the original land grant deed for the island, dated 1874. And the name of the grantee, clear as day, typed in stark, undeniable black letters, Moreau. My family, I printed it out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely feed the paper into the machine. I took the printed deed and laid it on the desk next to Adeline's diary, opened to the page where she described the day they purchased the land, the immense, terrifying hope of it all. They were a perfect match. The dates, the parcel numbers, the legal description of the island's boundaries. It wasn't a story. It was real. It was all real. They didn't buy this island. They took it. They took it from us. My husband's entire life. The beautiful house, the generational wealth, the social standing, the easy grace with which he moved through the world. It was all built on the foundations of a crime. A crime that had systematically and utterly destroyed my own lineage. I felt a wave of nausea. I looked around the study, at the expensive books, the antique furniture, the view of the moonlit sea from the window. It all looked different now, tainted. The beauty was a facade, a layer of gold leaf hiding something rotten and decayed beneath. I wasn't living in a fairy tale. I was living in a crime scene. I knew I needed to talk to someone. But who, Michael? How could I tell the man I loved that his entire identity was a lie? That his beloved great-grandfather was a thief? He was a good man, but he was a Beaumont. He was a product of their myth. He wouldn't be able to see it. Not yet. So I decided to talk to the keeper of the myth herself, Eleanor, Michael's grandmother, She was the family matriarch, a woman as formidable and enduring as the ancient oaks that dotted the island. She guarded the family's history with a quiet, fierce pride. I arranged a meeting with her under a guise she would find acceptable, even flattering. I told her I wanted to document the family history, to use my skills to create a proper archive of the Beaumont legacy. She was delighted. We sat in the grand library, surrounded by generations of Beaumont portraits, their painted eyes watching us. I started gently, asking about the early days, about the challenges Theron faced in taming this wild island. I watched her face, my historian's mind analyzing every flicker of her eyes, every subtle shift in her posture. Then I probed. "It's remarkable," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "to think this entire paradise was built from nothing. Was there truly no one here before Theron arrived?" Her eyes, a pale faded blue, hardened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, there were some people," she said, her voice airy, dismissive. "Sharecroppers, I believe. They had a small plot, but they couldn't manage their affairs. It was all quite sad. The land was falling into neglect." She took a delicate sip of her tea. "In a way, Theron rescued it, and there it was, the lie. Polished and practiced, passed down through the generations until it shone like the truth. Sharecroppers. Couldn't manage their affairs. Rescued the land." Each word was a careful, deliberate brushstroke, painting over the violent reality of the theft. I looked into her eyes, and I knew. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't a woman repeating a story she believed to be true. I saw a flicker of something else there, something ancient and deeply guarded. She knew. Maybe she didn't know all the details, not the way I did. But she knew the official story was a fabrication. That carefully constructed nonchalance was a wall, built to protect a secret she had carried her entire life. The lie wasn't just a story. It was an inheritance passed down right alongside the fortune. I ended the interview shortly after that, pleading a headache. My own head was pounding with the force of her denial. I went back to the study, back to the diary. I needed to know the rest. I needed to know how it ended. I read the final entries. The ink was smudged in places, the elegant cursive growing frantic, desperate. Adeline described the hurricane, a devastating storm that crippled the island's infrastructure and destroyed an entire season of crops. It was the opportunity Theron Beaumont had been waiting for. He called in all the debts at once. She wrote of the predatory loans, the deliberately confusing contracts he had entangled them in. They had no capital to repay. They were ruined. She described the day the bailiffs came, the day they were forced from their own home, with Theron Beaumont watching from the porch of the main house. His house now. I read the final line of the final entry. Her words felt like a brand on my soul. "He has stolen our future. May God not forgive him, for we never shall." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. And in that silence, everything shifted. The grief, the shock, the sense of violation. It all coalesced into a single hard point of clarity. This wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't about a historical injustice that needed to be documented. This was a debt of blood and time and stolen futures. The diary in my hands was no longer just a record of the past. It was an invoice, and I, Jessica Moreau, the last of my line to set foot on this stolen soil, was here to collect. My mission had begun. It began with the dust of the past. My past buried in their attic. Finding Adeline's diary wasn't an accident. In retrospect, it feels like an appointment I was destined to keep. For weeks, I lived a dual life. By day, the loving wife of Michael Beaumont, sleeping in the house my family's blood and tears had paid for. By night, I was a ghost, haunting the digital archives, piecing together the truth they had spent over a century burying. The truth was simple, brutal, and undeniable. This paradise was never theirs. It was ours. Every grain of sand, every ancient oak, every brick in that grand, monstrous house was stolen. The initial shock was a physical thing, a sickness in my gut. But shock gives way to grief, and grief, when nurtured by a righteous, burning anger, clarifies the mind. Speaking to Eleanor, the family's serene and smiling matriarch, was the final catalyst. In her casual, dismissive lies, I saw not a woman ignorant of the truth, but its most devoted guardian. She knew, they all knew on some level. They had inherited the lie along with the fortune. That was the moment the historian in me died, and something colder was born in her place. The past was no longer a subject to be studied. It was a weapon to be wielded. The diary was no longer a tragic artifact. It was an invoice. And the Beaumonts, with their easy grace and their blood-money smiles, had no idea that the debt was finally coming due. My mission was no longer about uncovering history. It was about correcting it. The first phase of any campaign is reconnaissance. You don't fire a single shot until you know the terrain. My terrain was the Beaumont family. Not the historical figures in the portraits, but the living, breathing dynasty. I needed to understand the modern architecture of their empire, to find the load-bearing walls. I needed to know precisely where to place the charges. My life with Michael had given me a front-row seat, but I had been watching the wrong play. I had been focused on the family, the people. Now I focused on the business. Beaumont Holdings wasn't just an inheritance. It was a living, breathing predator just like its founder. It had simply learned to hunt in boardrooms instead of on stolen farmland. My first target was Arthur, Michael's uncle. The current CEO, Arthur was the public face of the family, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community, a man who spoke in sonorous, reassuring platitudes about corporate responsibility and civic duty. He was a perfect replica of his grandfather, Theron, polished for the 21st century. I had sat across from him at a dozen family dinners, listening to his self-congratulatory anecdotes. Now I listened with new ears. I listened for the echoes. My academic background gave me an unusual skill set. I knew how to follow the money, not through spreadsheets, but through history. I started digging into the origins of their subsidiary companies. The official story was one of shrewd investments and American ingenuity. The truth, as always, was buried a little deeper. I found a pattern. Again and again, over decades, the Beaumonts had a peculiar habit of acquiring assets during times of public crisis. A local shipping company on the brink of collapse after a dockworkers' strike in the 70s. Vast tracts of farmland bought for pennies on the dollar during the farm crisis of the 80s. A portfolio of coastal properties acquired in the immediate aftermath of a devastating hurricane, long before the federal aid arrived and property values recovered. It was Theron's playbook, repeated on a grander scale. They didn't create value. They preyed on vulnerability. They circled, they waited for the wounded to fall, and then they feasted. Each acquisition was a ghost story, a smaller version of what they did to my family. They hadn't just stolen an island. They had built an empire out of other people's misfortune, and Arthur was the architect of its modern incarnation. But I needed more than a pattern of predatory capitalism. That was immoral, but not illegal. I needed a crime. A specific, provable crime. The key, I suspected, was a project Arthur was immensely proud of, the Beaumont Coastal Development Initiative. On the surface, it was a model of environmental consciousness. A plan to build a series of luxury, eco-friendly resorts on a stretch of protected coastline. Arthur had won awards for it. He'd given speeches about sustainable development and responsible tourism. He'd even partnered with a prominent environmental charity, the Coastal Stewardship Foundation, run by a charismatic activist named Dr. Alistair Finch. It all seemed too perfect. Too clean. So I started digging into Dr. Finch. My first discovery was a small one. A shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a dead end, a black hole designed to hide ownership. But they had made a mistake. The lawyer who filed the incorporation paperwork was the same lawyer who had handled a minor tax issue for Arthur Beaumont 5 years prior. A tiny thread. I pulled on it. For weeks, I fell down a rabbit hole of offshore accounts, nested shell companies, and labyrinthine money trails. It was a masterclass in modern corporate obfuscation. But I had something they didn't count on: time, and a historian's patience for sifting through mountains of meaningless data to find the one crucial connection. And then I found it. A wire transfer? A single 7-figure payment from that Cayman Shell Corporation to another, which then paid a consulting fee to a firm owned by Dr. Finch's wife. It was a bribe, laundered through 3 countries and 4 companies, as clean and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. Dr. Finch wasn't a partner. He was a paid consultant. His foundation's endorsement, the scientific reports they published praising the project's environmental soundness, the public support they generated, it was all bought and paid for. Arthur wasn't just building on protected land. He had paid an environmental group to lie for him, to betray their own stated mission, so he could do it. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction. This was it. This was the first crack in the foundation. It was the same sin, repeated. Theron used a hurricane to steal my family's land. Arthur was using the manufactured endorsement of a corrupt environmentalist to do the same thing to a public trust. The scale was different, but the soul of the crime was identical. Now I had the weapon. The next step was figuring out how to use it. Releasing it to the press was an option, but an unsatisfying one. It would be a scandal, yes. There might be fines, a public apology. Arthur might even step down as CEO. But the Beaumonts were masters of weathering storms. They would sacrifice a king to save the kingdom. The company, the fortune, the stolen island, all of it would remain. The debt would not be paid. No, this couldn't be a public attack. It had to be an internal one. It had to come from within the family itself. And that led me to the second pillar of the Beaumont dynasty, Eleanor. Eleanor wasn't just the matriarch. She was the family's moral compass, or more accurately, its moral arbiter. She was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of the Beaumont mythos. She held the family's history, and by extension, its identity, in her perfectly manicured hands. While Arthur controlled the money, Eleanor controlled the narrative. And in a family like the Beaumonts, the narrative was the more valuable asset. My relationship with her since our conversation in the library had been cordial, but strained. She watched me now. When I entered a room, her polite smile would tighten for a fraction of a second. She saw something in my eyes, I think. A reflection of the secret she was keeping. She didn't know what I knew, but she knew I was a threat. The historian who had asked the wrong question. I needed to get closer to her. To understand what she valued, what she feared. The answer, I realized, was obvious. She valued legacy above all else. The immaculate, unblemished story of the great Beaumont family. And she feared anything that might tarnish it. So I gave her a project. A way to polish that legacy. I've been thinking about what you said, I told her one afternoon, my voice filled with the earnest energy of a devoted daughter-in-law. About preserving the family's history. A book isn't enough. We should build a museum. Here, on the island. A permanent tribute to Theron's vision. I watched her face as I spoke. At first, there was suspicion. But then, as I laid out the vision, the beautifully curated exhibits, the interactive displays, the grand hall dedicated to the family's patriarch, I saw her vanity, her deep abiding pride begin to overwhelm her caution. A museum, her family, immortalized. It was an irresistible lure. She agreed. Enthusiastically, she gave me unrestricted access to the family archives, a vast, climate-controlled vault in the west wing of the house that I never knew existed. It was a historian's dream. Generations of letters, journals, business ledgers, photographs, the entire unvarnished history of the Beaumont clan. She believed I was searching for artifacts to display in her monument to a lie. She had no idea I was really searching for the truth, and what I found was illuminating. I found Theron's private ledgers, and in them, the cold, hard numbers that corresponded to the heartbreak in Adeline's diary. The predatory loans, the inflated interest rates, the final entry where he recorded the acquisition of the Moreau property for the price of the outstanding manufactured debt. A figure that was less than 10% of the land's assessed value at the time. He didn't even try to hide it in his private records. He was proud of it. He saw it as a masterful business transaction, but I found something else, too. Something I hadn't expected. I found Eleanor's own story. I found letters between her and her father, Arthur's father. Letters from the 1960s, a time of immense social upheaval. Eleanor, as a young woman, had been different. She had been involved in the civil rights movement. She had written passionate, idealistic letters about justice, about equality, about the moral failings of the country. She had even, in one scathing letter, condemned her own father for his exploitative business practices, calling him a vulture who profits from the pain of others. What had happened to that woman? The firebrand who believed in justice? I realized with a sickening certainty that she had made a choice. At some point, she had chosen the comfort of the lie over the difficulty of the truth. She had inherited not just the fortune, but the moral cowardice required to protect it. The idealist had died, and the matriarch had been born. And in that moment, I lost any shred of sympathy I might have had for her. She wasn't just a keeper of the secret. She was a hypocrite of the highest order. She knew, better than anyone, the rotten core at the heart of her family, because she had once, long ago, tried to fight against it and failed. Or worse, had simply given up. This knowledge was even more powerful than Arthur's financial crimes. This was a weapon aimed not at the family's fortune, but at its soul. While I was mapping the sins of the older generation, the echoes of the past began to manifest in the present, in my own life. In Michael. My relationship with my husband had become a performance, a carefully constructed act of normalcy. I still loved him. That was the most painful, most complicated part of it all. I loved the good, kind man he was. But I had come to despise the name he carried, the legacy that afforded him his kindness. His innocence was a luxury bought with my ancestors' ruin. How could I not see him differently? Every time he spoke of his family's hard work, every time he casually mentioned the privilege he knew he had but didn't truly understand the source of, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. He was oblivious. Utterly, completely, and happily oblivious. And his obliviousness felt like an insult. The breaking point came during a conversation about the museum project. He was so proud of me. So supportive. "It's incredible what you're doing," he said, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. "Honoring the family's history like this. Great-grandfather Theron. He was a true visionary. To come here with nothing and build all of this?" I almost told him then. The words were right there, burning on the tip of my tongue. He built it on the bones of my family. He came here with nothing and took everything from people who had even less. But I stopped. I looked at his open, loving, innocent face. And I realized he wouldn't understand. Not yet. Telling him now would be a catastrophe. He would see it as an attack, not a revelation. He would choose his family, the only truth he had ever known. And I would lose him. And I would lose my position on the inside. I would be cast out and the debt would go unpaid. So I swallowed the fire and I smiled. "He was a remarkable man," I said. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. That was the moment I understood the true tragic nature of the Beaumont legacy. It wasn't just the money. It was the mythology. It was a machine designed to protect itself, and its most effective component was the genuine goodness of people like Michael. His decency was a shield for their indecency. His love was a cover for their crimes, and I, his loving wife, was living inside that shield, sharpening my knives. I had the ammunition. Arthur's bribery. Eleanor's hypocrisy. I had the means to detonate the family from the inside. But I needed a delivery system. A way to ensure the explosion was contained, that the fallout hit only the targets I intended, and I needed to protect Michael. That was the one variable that complicated every equation. I needed to destroy his family while somehow saving him. I didn't yet know if that was possible. The plan began to form in my mind. It was audacious. It was dangerous. And it would require me to become a person I never imagined I could be. It would require me to be as cold, as calculating, and as ruthless as Theron Beaumont himself. I would use their own history against them. I would use their pride, their greed, and their secrets as my weapons. The museum, Eleanor's vanity project, would not be a celebration of their legacy. It would be a courthouse. And I would be the sole judge, jury, and executioner. The resurrection of the past was complete. Now it was time for the reckoning. My grief had become an engine. The historian's patient, methodical process of discovery was repurposed into something sharper, a tool for dismantling a dynasty. I became two people living under one roof. By day, I was the devoted wife, the meticulous curator of the Beaumont family's legacy, earning their trust, especially Eleanor's, by proposing the one thing she couldn't resist, a museum to immortalize their name. By night, I was a saboteur, poring over the documents she so willingly gave me, mapping the architecture of their corruption. I found the proof of my family's ruin in Theron's own proud ledgers, but I also found the rot in the modern branches of the family tree. Arthur, the CEO, with his philanthropic smile and his secret bribes to environmental watchdogs, was simply a modern echo of his grandfather's greed. And Eleanor, the family's moral guardian, was the greatest fraud of all, a youthful idealist who had long ago traded her conscience for comfort, burying her own condemnations of her family's evil under decades of practiced denial. My own marriage became a casualty, a performance of love for a man whose innocence was both his greatest virtue and the most painful insult to my family's memory. I had the weapons. I had the battlefield. The museum, their monument to a lie, would become the stage for its undoing. The past was no longer buried. It was resurrected, and it was waiting for its moment to speak. There is a unique kind of clarity that comes when you are building a trap. Every detail, every decision becomes imbued with a dual meaning. There is the meaning your victims see and the meaning you intend. For 6 months, I lived in that duality. My life was a masterpiece of deception, and the Beaumont Family Museum was my canvas. To the Beaumonts, I was the perfect, devoted curator. I obsessed over lighting fixtures, display case materials, the precise shade of paint on the walls. They saw it as a daughter-in-law's eagerness to please, a historian's passion for her subject. They had no idea that my obsession was with something else entirely. I wasn't designing an exhibit. I was calibrating a weapon. The main hall was dedicated to Theron, the visionary patriarch. We hung his official portrait, a massive, imposing oil painting where his eyes, unlike in Adeline's diary, seemed to smile with benevolence. We displayed his business accolades, his pioneering tools, the story of his hardship and triumph etched into brass plaques. This was the altar upon which the family worshipped, and it was the altar upon which they would be sacrificed. Hidden within this shrine was the mechanism of its own desecration. The centerpiece was a state-of-the-art interactive display, a large touchscreen table that would allow guests to explore the Beaumont family tree and its business ventures. Michael loved it. He saw it as a way to bring his family's history into the modern age. Arthur saw it as a brilliant piece of public relations. Eleanor saw it as a fittingly modern tribute. I coded a backdoor into the system. A hidden file partition, firewalled and encrypted, accessible only by a single, untraceable command. On the surface, the display was a glittering, interactive hagiography. But beneath that polished surface, the truth was lying dormant, waiting for the signal to rise. The final piece of the trap was a locket. I had found it tucked into the final pages of Adeline's diary, wrapped in a small piece of silk. It was hers. The only physical object I had left of my family from that time. A tiny silver vessel containing a world of pain. I had it professionally but subtly cleaned. And I created a new display case for it, right at the heart of the exhibit. The plaque simply read, Locket C. 1880, found on the island. Original owner unknown. Eleanor found it charming. A little piece of local color. A tribute to the anonymous people who had lived here before the Beaumonts brought civilization. The irony was so thick, so suffocating I could barely breathe when she approved it. The night of the gala arrived. It was a perfect, clear evening. The air was warm, the sky littered with stars. The estate was ablaze with light, cars lining the long, winding driveway. Hundreds of people were there, the state's most influential politicians, business leaders, society figures. It was the culmination of everything the Beaumonts believed themselves to be: powerful, respected, permanent. I wore a simple black dress. A splash of color in a sea of Beaumont-endorsed pastels. I felt strangely calm. An eye of the hurricane calm. I had rehearsed this night in my mind 1,000 times. I had walked through every step, anticipated every variable. Michael found me by the French doors overlooking the sea. He looked impossibly handsome in his tuxedo. He took my hands, his eyes shining with a love and a pride that felt like a physical wound. "You did it, Jess," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at this. You've given my family a gift they'll treasure forever." I looked into his eyes, his honest, loving eyes. And for a fleeting, terrible moment, I wanted to stop it all. I wanted to confess, to pull him away, to run away with him and leave the ghosts to their graves. I could have a life with this good man, a life of love and comfort and willful blindness. But then I saw it. Over his shoulder, through the crowd, I saw the portrait of Theron Beaumont hanging in the museum's entrance, his smug painted face mocking me. And beside it, I saw Eleanor, greeting the governor, the perfect picture of aristocratic grace. The lie. It was a living thing in that room, and it was choking me. I knew then that my choice had been made long ago, in a dusty attic with a leather-bound diary in my hands. I couldn't have a life built on a lie, even a beautiful one. It would be a betrayal of Adeline. It would be a betrayal of myself. I squeezed Michael's hands. "Tonight is for your family," I said, and the double meaning hung in the air between us, unheard by him. The speeches began after dinner. Arthur went first. He stood at a podium, bathed in a soft spotlight, the museum's grand entrance behind him. He was in his element, charming, magnanimous, powerful. He spoke of legacy, of corporate stewardship, of the family's commitment to the community. He spoke with particular pride about the Beaumont Coastal Development Initiative, mentioning the invaluable partnership with Dr. Alistair Finch and the Coastal Stewardship Foundation. He was building his own myth, right there in front of everyone. Then he turned to me. "And none of this," he said, his smile beaming, "would be possible without the vision and dedication of my brilliant niece-in-law, Jessica. Her work in creating this museum has enshrined the Beaumont legacy for generations to come. Jessica, would you like to say a few words and officially open the exhibit?" The applause was a wave of sound. Michael squeezed my arm, whispering, "Go on." This was it. I walked to the podium. The light was blinding. I could see hundreds of faces all looking at me, expecting a few polite, rehearsed words. I could feel Michael's proud gaze, Eleanor's satisfied smile, Arthur's smug condescension. I took a deep breath. "Thank you, Arthur," I began, my voice steady. It didn't even tremble. "You speak of legacy, and that is what a museum is for. To preserve a legacy, to tell a story. But the most important rule of history is that you must tell the whole story." I glanced over at the museum's technical director, a young man I had personally hired. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back, his finger hovering over a keyboard. "The Beaumont legacy, as you know it, is a story of vision and success," I continued, my eyes scanning the crowd. "But every story has more than one chapter. And tonight I'd like to add a few that have been overlooked." On the massive screen behind the podium, where the Beaumont family crest had been displayed, a new image appeared. It was a high-resolution scan of the Cayman Islands wire transfer. "For instance," I said, my voice cutting through the rising hum of confusion, "there is the chapter of the Beaumont Coastal Development Initiative, a project praised for its environmental sensitivity, thanks to the glowing endorsement of the Coastal Stewardship Foundation." Another document appeared on the screen, next to the first. The consulting fee paid to Dr. Finch's wife, but the historical record, if you look closely enough, tells a different story. It tells the story of a 7-figure bribe laundered through a series of shell corporations to buy that endorsement. It tells the story not of partnership, but of corruption. A gasp went through the crowd. I looked at Arthur. The color had drained from his face. His politician's smile had evaporated, leaving a slack-jawed mask of horror. He knew. He was looking at his own financial damnation, projected 20 feet high for the entire world to see. But I was just getting started. This pattern of predatory acquisition, however, is not a new chapter in the Beaumont story. It is, in fact, the founding principle. The screen changed again. On one side, a scanned page from Theron Beaumont's private ledger, showing the acquisition of the island for a pittance. On the other, a page from Adeline Moreau's diary, her frantic, heartbreaking handwriting describing the day they were evicted. The story you've been told is that Theron Beaumont arrived on a wild, untamed island. The truth, I said, my voice ringing with the force of a century of suppressed rage, is that this island was already owned. It was owned by a family of freedmen who had purchased it legally and were building a thriving community. A family named Moreau. I looked directly at Eleanor. Her face was a statue of ice. Her eyes, those pale blue eyes, were wide with a terror that was deeply, personally satisfying. The lie she had protected her entire life was dying right in front of her. Theron Beaumont did not build a legacy here. He stole one. He used predatory loans and the devastation of a hurricane to indebt and destroy the Moreau family, and then took their home, their land, and their future. The screen changed one last time. It split into 2 images. On the left, one of Eleanor's youthful, passionate letters with the phrase, "Vulture who profits from the pain of others," highlighted. On the right, the original land grant deed for the island, with the name Moreau clear as day. "The greatest tragedy," I said, my voice dropping, becoming softer, more personal, "is that this truth was not entirely unknown. Some in the Beaumont family have always known the rotten core at the heart of their fortune. They simply made a choice, to protect the comfort of the lie over the difficulty of the truth." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. The room was utterly still. No one was drinking champagne now. No one was smiling. I had turned their glittering party into a funeral. Then I looked at Michael. He was standing where I had left him, but he looked like a different person. He was pale, shaking his head slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a dawning, soul-crushing horror. He was looking at me, but it was as if he was looking at a stranger. A monster, the look in his eyes. It broke through my icy resolve. That was the price. The one cost I had tried foolishly to pretend I wouldn't have to pay. The full historical record, I said, my voice finally cracking with the weight of it all, has been sent to every major news outlet in the state, as well as to the SEC and the State Attorney General's office. I paused, and my final words were almost a whisper. The museum is now open, and then chaos. I didn't stay to watch the empire fall. I walked off the podium away from the lights and pushed through the panicked crowd. I only had one destination. I walked into the museum, into the heart of the exhibit. I went to the small glass case. Using a key from my pocket, I opened it and took out Adeline's locket. I closed my hand around its cool metal. Then I heard his voice behind me. "Jessica?" I turned. It was Michael. His face was ashen. His eyes were filled with a pain so deep it felt like it could swallow the world. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice raw. "I told the truth," I said softly. "The truth?" He let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You've destroyed my family. You've destroyed us. My whole life. Everything I believed. You've burned it to the ground. Was this all a lie, Jessica? Our marriage? Was it all just part of this plan?" I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to tell him that I loved him, that he was the one good and true thing in this whole nightmare. But what did that matter now? I had used that love. I had used him. My love for him was real, but my actions had made it a weapon. The plan, I said, my voice hollow, was to correct the historical record. To settle a debt. A debt? He spat, the words dripping with contempt. "You're talking about money and land that's been gone for 100 years? And for that you destroy the lives of people who are alive now? You destroy me?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tormented whisper. "I loved you, Jessica. I would have listened. We could have figured something out. Together. But you didn't trust me. You didn't love me enough for that. You just used me, and that was it." He was right. In my quest for righteous historical justice, I had become as ruthless as the man I sought to destroy. I had seen Michael's love not as a partnership, but as a strategic advantage. I had sacrificed the present on the altar of the past. He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something, anything, that could make sense of the ruins around him. He found nothing. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. And then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the wreckage of his family's legacy. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. The Beaumonts were ruined. Arthur is facing a raft of federal charges. Eleanor is a recluse, her health failing, her name a synonym for hypocrisy. The company is being dismantled, sold for parts. The fortune is gone. The island is tangled in a web of lawsuits that will take decades to unravel. The debt is paid. The account is settled. Adeline's ghost can finally rest. But the question I am left with in the quiet of the night is the one Michael asked me. Was it worth it? I avenged my family. I reclaimed their story from the silence of history. I brought a corrupt and predatory dynasty to its knees. I did what I set out to do. There is a grim, cold satisfaction in that. A sense of justice, hard and unyielding, but I see his face. The look in his eyes in that museum. The moment the man I loved looked at me and saw a stranger. I destroyed a good man? A man whose only crime was to be born with the wrong name. I broke the cycle of their sins, yes. But to do it, I had to break him. And I had to break myself. History is written by the victors. I won. I am the victor. And this is my diary. A story of a debt inherited and paid. But it is also the story of a price. A price so high, I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand if it was a price worth paying. The truth is, I still don't know. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible narrative. We have to ask you, what would you have done in Jessica's position? Was her revenge justified, or did she sacrifice a good man and her own future for the ghosts of the past? Let us know your complex thoughts in the comment section below. If this story resonated with you, please like the video to help us reach more people who appreciate deep storytelling. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story we unearth. Supporting the channel is as simple as sharing this video with a friend. Every single share helps us continue to bring these powerful narratives to light. Until next time, remember that every story has more than one chapter.